It's my pleasure this evening to welcome you all, students, staff, alumni and guests, to this evening's online lecture hosted by the Department of Computer Science and Informatics. Also, a special welcome to our guest speaker, Paul Clark, the former Chief Technology Officer at Ocado, who will this evening discuss where physical and digital worlds collide. I think given that this is an online lecture due to the pandemic and we're all now thinking through how to navigate a future in higher education and in society more widely, that for many will likely involve more digital and online presence, I think this is a very timely moment to listen to Paul's thoughts on this. My colleague, Professor George Roussos, head of the Department of Computer Science and Informatics, will introduce Paul to you all in more detail shortly. But before I hand over to him, I just want to say a few words, short words to introduce this lecture. So, we've held the Booth Memorial Lecture annually to commemorate the pioneering work of Andrew Booth and Kathleen Booth at Birkbeck. Andrew was part of the crystallography team at Birkbeck, joining in 1945, a year after gaining his PhD from Birmingham. In 1946, Kathleen Britton, as she was then known, joined Birkbeck, and thus began an extremely influential partnership, both professionally. Apparently Andrew built the computers and Kathleen was responsible for the programming, but also personally, with Andrew and Kathleen getting married in 1950, the same year that she gained her PhD in applied mathematics. However, prior to this, and the work that they're very, very well known for, really began in 1947, where they both undertook a 6-month US tour based at Princeton, where they worked with John von Neumann and where they redesigned the original automatic relay calculator. I apologise, I'm not a computer scientist, so a lot of these terms mean not a lot to me, but I'm sure to many of you, you're all very, very familiar with these. Soon after this, the ARC2 was again redesigned as an entirely electronic machine, which was called the Simple Electronic Computer. And then following on from this, in 1952, their best known machine, the all-purpose electronic computer, the APEC, was designed in Birkbeck's computation laboratory. This period was clearly a very dynamic, innovative and exciting period in which the collaboration between Andrew and Kathleen and many other scholars was extremely important in shaping the direction and development of computer science as a discipline. In addition to the all-purpose electronic computer, Andrew and Kathleen were involved in research on machine translation, on thin film storage technology for digital storage, and magnetic drum and disk storage, as well as inspiring many bright minds and supporting PhD students. Their pioneering work and the recognition of the need to create taught courses in the discipline led to the establishment of the Department of Numerical Automation in October 1957 here at Birkbeck, and the publication of the first teaching materials on modern numerical analysis, programming and computer design, such as the landmark book Programming for an Automatic Digital Calculator by Kathleen Booth in 1958. Now, apparently there is debate as to whether this was the first department established to teach computing in a UK university. Elsewhere, courses were still taught in computer laboratories, but it's fair to say that it was one of the first, if not the first, department in the UK, and it's grown to become our Department of Computer Science and Informatics, one of the leading research departments in the UK. I know that colleagues in the department are immensely proud of the early beginnings of the department. Not everybody has the opportunity to work in a place that has such an illustrious history with colleagues such as Andrew and Kathleen Booth, who were so influential with their work. My colleagues in the department today continue to produce world-leading research in algorithms, data science, knowledge representation and verification that informs our teaching and importantly has an impact on practice to address evolving organisational, technological and economic challenges within society. This commitment to the practical application of computer science is reflected in our guest speaker and topic this evening. Paul will be exploring the role of digital technology in the physical world and set out how technological advances in smart mobile machines, for example, provide opportunities for disruption and innovation to influence society. I want to thank Paul again for giving up his time this evening to present to us all, and I want to welcome you all to this evening's Booth Memorial Lecture. I will now pass over to my colleague, Professor George Roussos, head of the Department of Computer Science and Informatics, and I hope that you all have an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Clark, who until November 2020 was the Chief Technology Officer at Ocado, a world leader in smart fulfillment and logistics. After joining Ocado in 2006, Paul initially worked on warehouse control systems and then joined the team designing Ocado's next highly automated fulfillment center. After establishing new teams for simulation and mobile development, Paul then co-wrote his first of Ocado's award-winning mobile apps, of which I should say I'm a user. Ocado technology, with its 2,000 plus engineers, is responsible for building all the technology that powers Ocado's end-to-end e-commerce, fulfillment, and logistics platform. Having handed over the leadership of Ocado technology in April 2018, Paul led the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, whose mission included exploring opportunities to use Ocado's technologies and competencies to disrupt other sectors, including vertical farming, research activities, and the technology vision and future-proofing of the business. Paul read physics at Oxford University before entering the computer industry. He has worked in software engineering, consultancy, interim management, and a number of software startups. Paul sits on a number of government and industry advisory boards, including the AI Council, Robotics Growth Partnership, ISF Future Flight, National Food Strategy, and the Innovation Expert Group. And finally, in what little spare time he has alongside his work and family, Paul loves to invent and build stuff, design PCBs, write software, and generally tinker. And having have a very quick preview of some of his slides, I'm sure he will be talking about a lot of those issues very shortly. So before handing over to Paul to deliver his lecture, I should point out that there will be time for questions at the end, and you can either ask the questions yourself by raising your Teams hand, or you can post the questions in the chat, and I would be happy to read them to Paul. So Paul, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Right, I'll just grab the screen. Where are we? Screen 2. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. And a huge thank you to Birkbeck for inviting me. We nearly did it last year, but it's happening this year. And I thought I'd start my talk by talking a little bit about my personal journey that's led to me being here this afternoon. So my passion for writing software began at school, and having been very inspired by the Apollo missions, one of my early software programs was a moon landing simulator, which is where my interest in simulation and modeling began, which is going to be central to my talk this evening. And as has just been said, after I left school, I went to Oxford to read physics. And you might be thinking, well, why did you read physics rather than computer science? Well, the reason was I had, and indeed I still do have, a deep fascination in how the world works. And for me, that's what physics is all about. And I'd spent my childhood sort of reading technical books, such as car maintenance manuals, taking stuff apart, designing electronic circuits, blowing stuff up. So hopefully that kind of established me as my nerd credentials. But the other main reason was there weren't very many computer science courses in those days, and most people going into the computer industry did so via mathematics or a numerate science degree. So I looked for every possibility to weave computing into my physics degree, and this included digitizing one of my tutor's particle physics experiments and generating synthetic data or results for physics practicals with just enough errors to make the data plausible. Most of my career has been spent in startups. In fact, I nearly dropped out of my degree to do the first one, although I'm very glad looking back that I didn't. My experience of startups is they're a bit like sticking your fingers into a main socket for a few years. Amazingly exhilarating, educational, scary, all-consuming. It's a potent cocktail that becomes quite addictive. And after you've tasted the sort of freedom and innovation and culture of a startup, it's quite hard to go and work for a normal business. However, in 2006, I joined Ocado, which, although it was over 6 years old by then, still had the culture, mindset, and vision of a startup. although in those days most people probably thought it was an online grocery retailer, and indeed a few still do, but under the surface it was clearly a technology business. And if you dug a little deeper, you'd have discovered that in fact it was an innovation factory. I used to describe working at Ocado as being a bit like being on a roller coaster that was still under construction. You know, you'd come around a corner, you'd think you know what to expect, and then you'd find that someone had slapped a whole new barrel roll there, and that's kind of what kept it so exciting. But come last November, it was time for me to step off that nearly 15-year roller coaster ride. Much of that time, as has been said, I was, as Chief Technology Officer, leading the sharp end of that innovation factory. And now, really, I'm focused on these advisory roles across government, industry, and startups, which span areas like AI and synthetic environments, smart machines, innovation, the food system, and industrial strategy. So what am I going to talk about this evening? Well, much of that career, so far anyway, has been focused on this intersection of the digital and physical worlds. And where those two worlds collide live magical beasts such as smart machines and digital twins, and it's this intersection that I believe is where the really exciting things happen. And to set the scene for exploring that intersection, I want to talk a little bit about the cauldron of ingredients for innovation and disruption that I've been cooking with, the primordial soup of innovation, if you like. Some of these ingredients will be old friends of yours, whilst others might be new acquaintances. So you have to start with data. Data really is the fuel that powers all the other technologies, or many of them at least, and innovations. And indeed, at the start of the pandemic, one of the questions that was asked is, where's all the data that can help us better understand, you know, the characteristics of the virus and reduce transmission? And the answer was that much of the interesting data were locked away in silos, often within the private sector. And then there's all the data that simply didn't exist, particularly the kind of real-time crowdsourced data from sensors and citizens and other sources. And connecting the existing data sets would require shared standards and ontologies. And harvesting the missing data would require new infrastructure and services. But the challenge is that most of these data won't be open data. In other words, they won't be in the public domain. And so unlocking them will require granular mechanisms for the controlled and secure sharing of data, with whom, for what purposes, and potentially at what costs. Because just imagine, you know, you're an online grocery retailer. You might be willing to share your van road speed data with local authorities in order to reduce congestion and nitrous oxide levels. But you're not going to share those data with your competitors so they can reverse engineer where your customers live, because obviously that would be silly. But hopefully the government's national data strategy is going to deliver some of this missing national infrastructure. Next is the Internet of Things. And as many of you know, this is about a myriad of different sensors transmitting back their data. And some of these sensors will be fixed, whilst others will be on mobile connected smart machines, where they may be helping those smart machines to see, to feel, to hear, to navigate, and maybe even to smell and taste. And in the past, we used to stream all these data back via the cloud, but now edge computing is enabling us to process more and more of this raw data within the sensors themselves and to be more selective about what we send back, thereby reducing the demand for communications bandwidth and storage. So for example, you know, smart CCTV cameras that can process video in real time, learn what sort of events you're interested in, and then just send back the matching footage to the cloud. Another example is the swarms of the thousands of robots in each Ocado warehouse. Every robot generates about 5,000 data points, 1,000 times a second, which with a swarm of over 3,000 robots in just one facility is a lot of data. And these data are harvested and they're fed into a predictive healthcare system that tries to keep the swarm healthy by spotting the onset of problems before they occur. And this is analogous to what we could do for humans using wearables and sensors in the home and patient records to deliver scalable remote healthcare. But in Ocado's case, the patients are robots. The next ingredient is AI and machine learning, and we're all familiar with AI. It's already baked into many of the smart services and applications that we take for granted. But in the kind of Tolkien sense, this one really is the one to rule them all. But as you know, AI is not a single thing. It's a basket of different tools to solve different problems. For example, machine learning, image recognition, natural language processing, computer vision, and so on. And my personal view is actually the term artificial intelligence is an unfortunate misnomer, because it's not, I don't believe, about artificial human intelligence, but rather a new form of intelligence with different qualities, capabilities, and limitations. And as AIs get more complex, we won't want to assemble all the elements from scratch. So once again, we'll need those same sort of sharing mechanisms to enable us to combine AIs built and trained by different organizations. The next ingredient is synthetic environment, and this is a collective name for simulations, emulations, visualizations, and digital twins. And I'm going to need to drill into these individually. So simulations are software models, for example, of a building, a vehicle, a financial system, our natural environment, or whatever. And organizations like the Met Office have been building complex simulations of our weather systems for decades now. Simulations can be used to help understand and optimize entities that exist, but also to model those things that don't exist yet in order to predict and explore their potential behaviors. These models are built in software using a combination of maths, algorithms, statistics, physics, and increasingly machine learning to describe the entity being modeled. Simulations come in all shapes and sizes. You could create simulations of synthetic cells and DNA to model and predict their behaviors. And at the other extreme, you can build simulations of planetary systems. Now, Rutherford famously said, all science is either physics or stamp collecting. And as a physicist, I'm tempted to say that he was right, but it's also an unhelpful observation. For example, we're not going to be able to understand human psychology by studying particles at a subatomic level. To create models of higher level processes, you need levels of approximation and abstraction. For the same reason, simulations are also built with different levels of approximation and abstraction, and we're going to need to stitch them together vertically and horizontally. For example, it's theoretically possible that starting with simulations at the level of individual plant cells, that you could assemble a simulation of a complete tree and then of a whole forest. However, the complexity of such a model and the computational power to run it mean it would be completely impractical. So instead, you'd probably build more abstracted and approximate models of larger entities such as plants and trees and use those to assemble your forest simulation. Simulations offer many benefits, including simulating projects before you fund them. My personal view is that building a simulation should be the first step in all publicly funded research and infrastructure projects. Simulating projects before you implement them to reduce risk, cost, and time to build, but also to stress test for exceptions. Reducing the cost and the impact of maintenance. Modeling integration of systems with the wider ecosystem to make sure they fit together. Improving sustainability through optimized use of scarce resources such as land, energy, and materials. Connecting AIs to simulations to enable them to get physical and to explore virtual worlds to create designs and optimizations whose complexities are beyond human scale. And a great example of that last point was AlphaGo Zero, because in March 2016, DeepMind's AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, one of the best Go players in the world. And AlphaGo had been trained with 100,000 games played by humans, but then in 2017, DeepMind created AlphaGo Zero that learned from scratch by playing itself, armed only with a simulation of Go and the rules of Go. And in a matter of days, AlphaGo Zero was better than its human-trained predecessor and had discovered moves now famous that no human had found in over 2,000 years of playing the game. And simulations can also be used to create immersive environments for education, training, and reskilling, potentially in combination with technologies such as VR and AR. For example, flight simulators enabling pilots to learn to fly a new aircraft before that aircraft exists, including responding to emergencies such as a bird strike or an engine fire. And once again, the pandemic has shown us that we need much better tools for remote learning. And note that I say learning, not teaching, which is a topic I'll come back to. Simulations can be run many times faster than real time. For example, enabling you to test the design of an automated warehouse by subjecting it to a year's worth of customer orders or in a matter of minutes. Simulations need to include the statistical randomness that is baked into our world. If you run a simulation that embodies those statistical variations twice, you'll get slightly different results. Keep running them lots of times, and the results you get will map out an envelope of all the possible results and the probability distribution for getting a specific result. And this is what's known as Monte Carlo simulation. Emulations, the next of the synthetic environment family, are higher fidelity. They're more accurate models of a physical entity that represent the behavior of the actual hardware. For example, modeling the internal components of an engine and how they move. To achieve this greater accuracy, emulations typically have to worry about physical complexities such as friction, gravity, statistical variations in the behavior of components, and so on. By more accurately representing the physical entity, emulations enable you to run the production software on top of the emulation. For example, the emulation of a car engine would enable you to test the engine management software before the real engine exists, thus speeding up development and reducing the risk of problems downstream. Emulations have to run in real time because otherwise the production software would get confused. They can include components of the real hardware. For example, when designing a car, you might start with a completely digital model, but then perhaps replace the simulation of the dashboard with a real dashboard, enabling the designer to interact with it. This is called hardware-in-the-loop emulation. It allows engineers to gradually move from a fully digital model to the final physical product or system. Visualizations bring data to life, whether those be data from a simulation, an emulation, a digital twin, or indeed the production system itself. Visualizations help increase understanding, generate insights, and manage complexity. For example, in a complex system, you can use a visualization to remove those elements that you're not interested in so that you can see the wood for the trees. Visualizations are typically constructed as the overlay of multiple layers, with each layer representing different aspects of the physical system. For example, a visualization of an aircraft might be split into layers for things like the airframe, control surfaces, wiring, hydraulics, the control systems, and so on. And they enable you to ask questions that you couldn't answer even if you were stood next to the physical system. And you can do things like play the visualization back or forwards in time. The term digital twin is a much misunderstood one, and it means very different things to different people. So I'm afraid tonight you're going to get my definition of what a true digital twin is. Simulations become digital twins when you bidirectionally couple them to their physical twin. So imagine you wanted to optimize traffic flow around London, say. You'd probably add cameras and sensors to the traffic junctions to record information about the flows of vehicle and people. You'd then stream all that data to the cloud. You'd then build a simulation of the road network, traffic lights, cars and people, and you'd feed the data in from the cloud, and then you'd run studies to optimize things like the timing of the traffic lights and the topology of alternative road layouts. But then you might update the timing of the actual traffic lights with the optimized settings, and now you have turned your simulation into a true digital twin. And the digital twin can accompany the physical twin throughout its lifetime, optimizing behaviors, predicting failures before they occur, testing new control system algorithms before they're deployed into production, and so on. And one of the first digital twins ever constructed was of the Apollo 13 spacecraft. NASA used it to train the astronauts before the mission, but they also, when disaster struck, used it to explore options for getting the 3 astronauts back to Earth safely, as depicted in the famous film of that mission. More recently, SpaceX made extensive use of synthetic environments to develop and test their technologies, to model the end-to-end missions, and to train their astronauts. And if you listen carefully, the commander of the first flight to the International Space Station, just after docking at the ISS, referred to how the experience had compared with the training simulator. One day, we may be able to build digital twins of people, personal digital twins. These could be very useful in areas such as healthcare, but they would raise all sorts of security and ethical issues. But the good news is you don't have to worry, because they're a long way off. We really struggle to model the physiology of plants at the moment, let alone humans. If you're interested in reading more about digital twins, you can read the blog I wrote on Ocado's journey with synthetic environments for the Cambridge Data-Centric Engineering Department, and you just need to search for DCE Paul Clark. The real power, though, of digital twins comes when you connect them together. For example, connecting together the digital twins of an aircraft airframe, its engines, its control surfaces, and so on to create a digital twin of a complete aircraft. Then connecting the digital twins of an aircraft, airlines, air traffic control systems, airports, and many others to create a digital twin of the aviation sector. Adding in digital twins of roads, railways, and seaports to create a digital twin of the transportation system. Adding in digital twins of the energy network, logistics networks, consumer demand. And if you were to keep going on this journey, you would eventually assemble a digital twin of the UK. And this is the vision of the National Digital Twin Programme, led by the Centre for Digital Built Britain, supported by other stakeholders, including myself. The next step would be a planetary digital twin. And a growing number of organisations and stakeholders, such as myself, are proposing that we should build digital twins of our planet. to help us understand our environmental systems better and to reduce the impact of our man-made systems upon them. These visions will require us to stitch together digital twins horizontally and vertically, digital twins that may have been built by different organizations with different technologies at different levels of fidelity and abstraction and for different purposes. Synthetic environments enable us to construct entire virtual worlds. A great example of this are video games like Grand Theft Auto. All the actors in the game, people, weapons, cars, and so on are individually modeled. Physics engines are used to make sure these actors move and behave in realistic ways. These virtual worlds are so sophisticated and realistic that autonomous vehicle manufacturers often use them to test their software. However, these virtual worlds aren't limited to just modeling our known world. You can create virtual worlds that operate with completely different paradigms and with different laws of physics. For example, you could create a Groundhog Day world, which resets at midnight, and so it's all about what you can achieve in one day. Or a LinkedIn world in which your power and wealth is directly connected to the size of your network. Or a Russian doll world where your world has other worlds embedded within it and itself is embedded within a bigger world, and so on. Just as you can earn credits in video games, people could get up in the morning and then go to these virtual second worlds to earn money, meet people, solve problems, learn new skills, and so on. Then either accumulate these assets in their second world or bring them back to their first world. Arguably, the first and second worlds have just been flipped. This is a stepping stone towards the possibility of immortality, where our AI-powered digital twins can live on in virtual worlds after our death. But that is definitely a topic for another day. Moving on to the physical, we need to turn up the physical dial on the graphic equalizer of innovation, because the physical is often seen as dirty, messy, and less academic. For example, design technology is often seen as less academic than, say, further maths. The physical is seen as harder, hence the phrase hardware is hard. Venture capitalists often don't like to invest in hardware startups. And we need to democratize innovation. It needs to be something that citizens feel part of rather than something that somebody else does and then is done to you. You can sit in your bedroom armed with a credit card and a cloud account and design a successful mobile app. But speaking from personal experience, it's much harder to get physical prototypes manufactured. We need to foster the next generation of inventors and tinkerers, and one step towards that would be to build a national network of maker labs. And when the pandemic hit, engineers and researchers at Ocado headed home with 3D printers under their arms and used Ocado's extensive investment in synthetic environments to be able to continue their work largely uninterrupted. But what those engineers were denied access to was their robotics labs. And the same was true for researchers from other institutions and indeed undergraduates and at universities. So we need to create virtual labs, which will come in two flavors. The first are simulated virtual labs in which researchers can perform digital experiments. The second are physical labs, but with robots in them that can be remotely controlled using teleoperation and haptics. Teleoperation, for those not familiar, are about being able to remotely control a robot using a joystick or glove, say, typically over communications technologies such as 5G. And haptics is about the person controlling the robot being able to feel what the robot is touching using vibrational and other feedback. And these labs will be important not just for future lockdowns should they occur, but to facilitate greater and more diverse remote collaboration between researchers internationally as we all try to travel less for sustainability reasons. As I've been illustrating, you can do a lot in synthetic environments, but eventually you need to move to the real world to test the sorts of things we struggle to model digitally, such as public acceptance, ethics, privacy, and trust. And this is where living labs come in. They are experimental environments that are representative of the real world, but initially more constrained, where you can test your immature product or service, a bit like fitting stabilizers to a child's bike. As the product or service matures and your confidence increases, you can then loosen those constraints until you've closed the gap with the real world. Now, living labs are often confused with test beds, but they're different because test beds are all about consistency and repeatability, but living labs are about diversity and unpredictability. They're about learning by doing, often delivering real services to real people, and it's the people that create the diversity and the unpredictability. Living labs are a solution pattern that is applicable to many problem areas such as autonomous vehicles, AIs, digital twins, and so on. so on, excuse me. Smart machines is a collective smart machines is a collective term for robots, including robots that move, such as autonomous vehicles and drones. Robots that have built-in sensing and intelligence to power things like navigation, inference, threat avoidance, exception handling, self-repair, and so on. And just like humans, engineered smart machines don't burst into the world as mature adults. Their conception and gestation is normally within synthetic environments, as I've been describing. Then gradually they're exposed to aspects of the physical world using things like test rigs, hardware-in-the-loop emulation, and external sensors that capture real-world data. The next step is to allow them out into the world, but in those constrained living lab environments. And eventually the smart machines can be allowed out into the real world. And even then, teleoperation allows humans to scalably step back into the loop and take control if and when the smart machine encounters a problem that it can't solve. And this is rather like a watchful parent, ready to offer advice and assistance during adolescence and even adulthood. And then a digital twin, as I said, of the smart machine can occupy it throughout its lifetime. Now, one of the challenges we face in creating smart machines that are able to do things we take for granted is that we're competing with 3.5 billion years of evolution. Much of our smartness is delegated to our nervous system and the neurons around our bodies. This much faster, hardwired, more instinctual System 1 intelligence just happens in the background, allowing our conscious brains to focus on higher level reasoning. In the smart machines we currently build, everything typically has to be done in power-hungry microprocessors. Now, smart machines can operate independently or in swarms. They can be autonomous or orchestrated, a bit like the drones that created this lighting display. For example, on a motorway, it might make sense for autonomous vehicles to be orchestrated so that they can travel closer together and be controlled by a sort of central hive mind. However, in urban settings, they need to be autonomous because they need to respond to all sorts of unpredictable events and threats, such as someone suddenly stepping out in front of them. Social science is a vitally important ingredient in this cauldron, but it's often overlooked. How will somebody feel when a robot covered in cameras and sensors comes to their door to deliver a parcel or fix their washing machine? What should it look like to engender greater trust? What are the privacy issues relating to all those data being gathered by the robots? We need privacy, security, ethics, and trust baked in by design. And as I explained with Living Labs, we need people involved in the innovation lifecycle. Having explored that cauldron of ingredients, I now want to focus a little bit on the alchemical innovation recipes for cooking with those ingredients. And this is a very topical point because the government has announced that it's going to be publishing an innovation strategy for the UK soon. And it also relates to the government's decision to create the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency, ARIA, which will become an important piece of the UK's innovation landscape. Innovation is a very big topic, and I only have time to scratch the surface, but here are a few of my thoughts on innovation and how to run a successful innovation factory. Successful innovation, let alone disruption, is an inherently non-linear, messy, uncertain, risky, and frankly naughty process. It's that alchemical cauldron of potential ingredients reacting with one another in weird and unpredictable ways. Linear, neat, tidy ROI and data-driven recipes for innovation just don't cook well. You need to embrace uncertainty, ambiguity, unconventionality, and failure, whilst harnessing the power of bold, disruptive vision, serendipity, intuition, and leaps of faith. Innovation, in my view, needs to be a managed spread bet across different time, risk, and technology horizons, with separate compartments focused on those different horizons, separated by semi-porous membranes that allow things like people, ideas, competencies, and ways of working to flow between them. Now, coming to our aid are a number of innovation superpowers. The first is 10x thinking, looking for completely new ways to solve a problem that would deliver not a 10% incremental in benefit, but a 10 times improvement. For example, if somebody says to you, create a petrol engine that's 10% more fuel efficient, you can probably do that with incremental improvement. But if they ask you to make one that is 10 times as fuel efficient, you're going to have to reinvent the concept of the internal combustion engine from scratch. 10x solutions are often based on technologies that don't yet exist, are too expensive, or are not yet sufficiently performant. They are often a calculated bet on the future. They require you to empower your teams to spend some time looking for stuff that makes no sense on paper, but might just be game-changing, looking, if you like, for the innovation wormholes. Intersectional thinking. You need to pursue a dual strategy of planned missions and off-piste exploration, because some of the most exciting innovation lies at the intersection of different disciplines, and this is where you will find the innovational dark matter. The planned missions take you to vantage points where you can see something potentially interesting but more risky, and then you need to explore it with an off-piste mission. Just like climbing a mountain like Everest, you need to establish camps to support your expedition. And this is the role of research institutions, and there are a special breed of such institutions that are focused on intersectional thinking and exploration. For example, the Santa Fe Institute, the MIT Media Lab, Bell Labs, and Xerox PARC. And the fact is, we need some of these in the UK. The next superpower is Russian doll thinking, because you need to focus not just on the current challenges and opportunities, but on the ones behind those, on the ones behind them, what I call first derivative thinking. An example from my world is that it's not just about the robots, but about the robots that will make and maintain the robots, and the robots that will construct the factories where the robots that make the robots are themselves made, and so on. And the next is seeing around corners, or periscope thinking. I've spent much of my career as a piece of disruptive grit in a few different oysters, trying to get leaders to understand there are things they can't see, and where possibly to actually see those things. The fact is, we all have our blind spots and are susceptible to groupthink and bias. So you need to put structures and systems in place to try and guard against those known and unknown unknowns. This requires humility, power sharing, embracing disagreement, and a willingness to accept your own limitations, qualities that leaders often struggle with. As a recovering CTO, you might expect me to say that innovation is all about technology, but you'd be wrong. In my experience, technology challenges are typically dwarfed by the people challenges associated with creating a scalable and sustainable innovation factory. For example, things like culture and the constant cultural gardening required as you grow and evolve your organization, inspiring and supporting your people to do things they had no idea they could achieve, talent spotting to constantly expand the diversity and competencies of your gene pool, including taking recruitment risks because talent doesn't always come in neatly shaped and labeled packages. Like those technologies, people also react with one another in weird and wonderful ways. Sitting in a group of talented and creative individuals who are sparking off one another, playfully using analogies and stories to sidestep their left brains, daring to share ideas without fear of being shot down, is a truly inspiring process to be immersed in. If you want your people to be innovative, you've got to tell them that you expect them to be innovative. You need to structure your business and processes to facilitate it. You need a strong vision to direct it. And then you need to light the blue touch paper, retire, and get the hell out of their way. Helping your people reframe the inevitable feelings of uncertainty into feelings of excitement about the journey of discovery they're on is really important. And you might think that it's going to be individuals with mortgages and children that will struggle most with uncertainty, but in my experience, it's often fresh graduates who may be embracing that uncertainty for the first time. And it's those sorts of ingredients that make the art of innovation, and hence its leadership, so nonlinear and yet so exciting. And innovation requires an innovation ecosystem to support it. And here's an analogy from a living ecosystem. It takes time to establish a healthy, sustainable soil, just as it takes time to establish a healthy innovation ecosystem. The soil needs to be fed and replenished, as well as trying to just grow cash crops. There's the role of things like enzymes, minerals, nutrients, microorganisms, and worms within the soil. There's the drivers of change, for example, the environment, natural disasters, and evolution. There's the fact that these are highly nonlinear in terms of their impact. There's the fact that when you stress plants, it forces them to adapt, just as we've had to innovate fast to respond to the pandemic. There's all sorts of cycles at play, for example, water, carbon, reproduction, gestation, growth, the food chain, and evolution. These different cycles have different time constants and feedback loops. And once again, they're very nonlinear. The whole system is nonlinear, messy and uncertain. The pollination of plants and ideas, how seeds are spread by wind, animals and insects. Processes like death, decay, waste, composting, recycling of plants and indeed ideas. And then finally, sunlight as the source of energy. Plants grow towards it, just as we innovate towards a vision. Photosynthesis as a food factory, analogous to an innovation factory. Now, the pandemic has been a stern tutor. It's taught us lots of lessons. For example, the need for much more data, like I was talking about earlier, including that real-time data, the need for better tools for remote collaboration, and the fact that video conferencing just doesn't cut it. The need for much better tools for immersive remote learning and training, the importance of all sorts of models and simulations, the fact that we're missing lots of smart machines to do things like safely clean our hospitals, to do agile configurable manufacturing of things like PPE, to power orchestrated autonomous scalable logistics for distributing critical supplies, the fragility of our man-made infrastructure and systems. Because if stacking 3 boxes of animals in the wrong order in a Chinese wet market can bring down a planet, at least in terms of the dominant species, we've clearly got a lot to fix in terms of resilience, and it's at a planetary scale. The solutions to these challenges are some of the tools we failed to build in the previous peacetimes, not because nobody thought of them, but because we simply were not prioritized. Well, we're going to have to build them in the next peacetime. The countries that have coped best with the pandemic arguably had the best tools rather than the best plans. We need these tools not just to prepare for future pandemics and other exogenous shocks like climate change, but also to power greater prosperity, resilience, diversity, and sustainability during normal times. We need to reframe the concept of infrastructure. Infrastructure is not just roads, railways, and fiber broadband to rural communities. It's also the enabling cyber-physical infrastructure that's often hidden. Big verticals lack the time, budget, capabilities, and often the vision to build this horizontal enabling infrastructure themselves, let alone to support other initiatives. So a growing coalition of the willing, led by the Robotics Growth Partnership that I co-chair, are engaging with government and other stakeholders on a vision for a national horizontal cyber-physical infrastructure, which we're calling a cyber-physical fabric. And here are a few of the threads of that fabric. The data infrastructure I talked about earlier, a new open source framework for building synthetic environments to help make them an affordable and accessible commodity, especially for startups, SMEs, and the public sector. Smart glue in the form of digital commons for connecting digital twins and synthetic environments into powerful ecosystems at a national and planetary scale. Shared synthetic environments to support end-to-end ideation, design, and testing of new products and services, which by driving greater collaboration, coordination, and communication would turbocharge innovation programs. Pre-competitive shared cyber-physical building blocks for creating all manner of new smart machines that once woven into the fabric of our everyday lives will deliver prosperity, agility, scalability, resilience, and sustainability during normal times, ready to be conscripted when trouble strikes. AI in all its forms, as I mentioned earlier. Virtual worlds providing immersive environments for lifelong learning and training and reskilling that not only transform the educational experience, but also provide leveled up access by anyone from anywhere. Networks of maker labs, virtual labs and living labs at a national scale. Cyber-physical campuses, physical spaces but with immersive remote access that pull together a blend of many different stakeholders, including researchers, entrepreneurs, investors, regulators, students, and the general public. So what would the benefits of such a cyber-physical fabric be? Well, a bit like the World Wide Web, it's almost impossible to predict the first order, let alone the second order benefits. Just as when Tim Berners-Lee went around with his white van persuading academics to connect their servers to his vision for the World Wide Web, it wasn't based on a detailed business plan. It was a bold vision and a leap of faith. And I've already alluded to some of the benefits in areas like innovation and education, but here are a few more. So healthcare, digital twins of patients, primary care, hospitals and trusts, and ultimately the NHS as a system of systems, transforming the quality, scalability and sustainability of healthcare provision. Remote monitoring of patients in their homes, delivering greater freedom and predictive interventions. All manner of smart machines improving safety and efficiency in areas such as surgery, logistics, cleaning, and even social care. Building digital twins of our food system, including measuring and modeling the externalities of conventional agriculture that are largely hidden and generating environmental debt for future generations, modeling and developing new alternative forms of agriculture to turn photons into calories and proteins in sustainable ways, swarms of clean energy powered smart machines on and under the land, on and under the water, in the air and even in space, transforming how we move people and goods around our planet in more efficient, scalable and sustainable ways, what I refer to as an Internet of Atoms. These machines will be both autonomous and orchestrated by smart services, powered by digital twins and AI. Leisure and the arts, new forms of immersive entertainment built around weaving together synthetic environments, AI and smart machines, transporting us to new virtual worlds we could never visit, but also enabling exploration of those parts of our planet that most people could not afford to visit, or that we have to stop visiting so much in order to reduce the environmental impact. New forms of immersive collaborative art and drama with increased diversity in terms of their content and audiences as a result of being accessible across societies, cultures and countries. And all of this at the core of the UK's contribution to international collaboration on cyber-physical services at a planetary scale to help deliver on our net zero and sustainable development goals. Harnessing data, AIs and digital twins to increase the understanding of our natural world and reduce the impact of our man-made systems upon it, and then orchestrating swarms of clean energy powered smart machines to help clean up, replant and repair our planet. This is a very big, bold, expansive vision. If you like, it's a horizontal Earth shot, but it would be built incrementally with many tangible benefits delivered along the journey. This cyber-physical fabric would be a piece of shared enabling national horizontal infrastructure to support many verticals and moonshots. A fabric that stitches together our physical and digital worlds, a fabric that could be as transformative as the World Wide Web, and like the web, would be owned by nobody but used by everybody. The UK could lead the world in weaving this fabric for itself, creating sovereign capability, IP, and defensible competitive advantage for this country, whilst delivering on our aspiration to become a science superpower. At the same time, collaborating with our allies to foster international standards, platforms, and services to tackle the planetary scale challenges we face. My personal view, though, is the pandemic has just been a dress rehearsal and hopefully a wake-up call for the challenges ahead that we face as a country and indeed as a species, such as climate change. So we need to think bigger, much bigger, as individuals, as organizations, as a country, and indeed as a species. We need a really big, bold, holistic and long-term vision for this country and indeed for our planet. The current generation will have to initiate solving these 20+ year challenges, but it would be future generations that will have to see them through. And for me, this has significant implications on education, not just in terms of what we teach, but how students learn and the skills that they will need to acquire. So given today's audience, I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about my perspectives on education, if you'll forgive me for doing that. Now, one of the key challenges the UK faces in responding to the opportunities created by technologies like AI, digital twins and smart machines is the skills deficit. These skills, as many of you know, lie at the most overheated end of the engineering skills spectrum, and there's a massive shortage of graduates and postgraduates emerging with these skills. But what's not talked about enough is the fact that these skills lie at the end of a cyber-physical literacy pipeline that stretches all the way back to primary school. There's a massive amount more that governments, NGOs and business could do to help manage the flow along the entire length of this pipeline and to plug leaks. If we want a larger and more diverse set of graduates emerging at the end of this pipeline, then we have to do much more at the early stages. These are essential transformative skills, not just for those who may go on to become software and hardware engineers, but for everyone. True digital literacy is much more than just teaching children to code. For example, we need to teach them to be data literate, to understand how to organize and manipulate data, to gain insights from data, to visualize them, to build models from them, to understand the dangers of bias and so on. We also need to help our children understand the amazing possibilities and current limitations of technologies such as AI and robotics, the important ethical and philosophical questions around their applications, what it means to be human, and so on. We need to find ways to maintain the level of interest in STEM subjects demonstrated by girls of primary school age, which currently decay as they progress through the educational system. We need to be weaving this cyber-physical literacy throughout the curriculum. This educational pipeline, though, must not stop at school or university. It needs to continue on into the workplace and beyond. And here we need to do much more to incentivize organizations to invest in continual learning, particularly when it comes to subjects such as AI and robotics. We need to fuzz the boundary between education and work life and to disrupt the current linear path of go to school, go to college, go to work, do not repeat. We need to prepare children for the process of continual learning and the inevitable reskilling that awaits them. We need to teach self-reinvention as a meta skill and to reframe the midlife crisis into an art form. But we need to do more, much more, because many of the skills and techniques we're currently teaching our children will be as devalued in the years to come as the encyclopedia has been by the advent of the World Wide Web. Instead, we need to focus on teaching enduring meta skills such as learning how to learn, collaboration, creative thinking, problem solving, intersectional thinking, mind mapping, design thinking, goal setting, emotional intelligence, innovation and entrepreneurship. If education is all about preparing the next generation for their future life and instilling a love of learning, then I believe we're failing in terms of the structure and curriculum of our current education system. The current relentless focus on exams, tests, and the regurgitation of mark schemes is consuming almost all of the educational oxygen, leaving teachers with little or no time for spontaneity, for sharing their love of a subject, and for just pursuing the curiosity of their students to see where it might lead. If we allow education to switch our students off the joy of learning, then we will do them an incalculable disservice. On the other hand, if we enable our children to leave school having learnt how to learn, full of curiosity, armed with a holistic set of future-proof skills, and with a joy of ongoing learning, then I believe they will be well equipped for their life ahead. So I believe we need to completely rethink our education system from the ground up, and in so doing, future-proof the underlying curriculum to prepare the next generation for this much smarter and more automated world that they will inherit. In terms of that wake-up call, the big danger as I see it is that once we're all fully vaccinated, life has unlocked and recovery is underway, that planetary scale oxytocin kicks in. It will deaden the pain that we've lived through, the price that we've paid, and it will allow short-term thinking to return. As individuals, as organizations, as a country, and indeed as a species, I feel passionately that we must not allow that to occur. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Paul. And this is where Teams lets us down, because if we were at the college now, you would have received the proper applause, which the technology does not allow us to do. I think there were a lot of things to address in your talk. And I guess I'll read the first question, which has arrived through the chat from a friend of the department, Kostis Kompis. So the question is, what ratio of engineering effort should be devoted to anticipate and simulate black swan events, such as beyond what is normally expected of a situation and will potentially have severe consequences, and how the size of an operational organization affects such effort allocation?
Oh, it's a great question. I do think that, as I try to talk about in terms of innovation, dedicating, some of your engineering effort to think the unthinkable, to operate to completely different rules of engagement, different missions with different skill sets. I mean, this is kind of what the office of the CTO that I ran in the last couple of years at Ocado was about. It was outside of the mothership, and I think one of the challenges of organizations as they get bigger is that inevitably, however innovative you are, business as usual can start to filter out things that you perhaps would have, risks you would have taken, or things you would have thought, or people you would have hired, become much more difficult, and you almost need to find new ways to get beyond that. I mean, this is the kind of innovator's dilemma that Christensen talked about, and so you do have to create these compartments that I've mentioned, and it is a managed spread bet, and I don't think there is a universal answer for exactly how much time you should dedicate there. But it's to a certain extent, it's probably more than you're comfortable dedicating, because it's a bit like, cybersecurity. You think you've spent enough on it, and then you get a breach and you realize you haven't spent enough. Well, when you get disrupted by somebody else, you'll look back and think, crikey, why didn't we see that coming? And indeed, as you've rightly said, sometimes those things aren't competition. They are these kind of black swan events. And obviously we're living through one of them. But of course, people did predict pandemics, and as I said, those countries that had the best tools perhaps responded to them, in the best way. So I don't think I can answer that question, because I don't think it would be a single answer. But I suppose my answer would be, it's definitely not zero, and it's probably more than you're comfortable with. And I think, but this is where, once again, simulation can really help, because you can use simulation to explore those kind of extreme events, the outliers, much more cheaply and much faster than you can do, with physical innovation. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Paul. As I said before, you can either raise your hands and ask a question directly to Paul, or post something in the chat. So Catherine has a question.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that gallop through the possibilities of the future in a very exciting way. I just wonder, you didn't mention batteries anywhere in the speeding through, and I just wonder what you have to say about that, given so much of what you're envisaging here and the possibilities seem in some way to be linked to
that. Battery technology, I mean, there's outside of that cauldron, there's a whole other list of enabling technologies which are absolutely crucial. And you're absolutely right, Catherine. Batteries is definitely, one of them, as are, new kinds of motor technology and so forth. And indeed, during my time at Ocado, batteries were a very important part of what we focused on, because the robots that whizzed around in those warehouses were all battery powered and would come in for charging. So batteries, but also battery management and that kind of healthcare system that I mentioned. One of the things it would look at is how healthy are the batteries, how well are they charging and discharging. And we need not just new kinds of battery technologies, but obviously new kinds of clean energy technologies. People have obviously worked out that you're not going to get the energy densities required for aircraft using batteries. So we're going to have to use hydrogen or something else. And people are experimenting with small scale modular reactors who believe in using nuclear for those purposes. So there are going to be lots of different ways to skin this cat, but one way or another, and maybe one day we'll get cold fusion, or fusion at least. But I mean, the fact is, it's absolutely crucial, and because we may be able to generate renewable energy, but if we can't store it and put it into these smart machines and give them decent kind of lifetimes in terms of before they have to come back, then that's going to be very limiting in terms of what they can do. As well as the fact that as we know well from the whole electric vehicle game that is playing out at the moment, it has significant implications for the infrastructure that you have to build around a country if you want everyone to move over to electric vehicles. But the same will be true for drones and for other kinds of smart machine that are going around doing our bidding. So completely agree. Batteries, but and I think it's going to be very interesting in the innovation strategy what are seen as the kind of technologies. If I'd had more time in today's talk, I might have talked about something that I think is a very important question for not only organizations but this country, which is where can we have truly differentiating and sustainable competitive advantage? We can kid ourselves that we can do everything, but we can't. And this is true for organizations, but it's also true for a country. And so you kind of have to work out, what you're going to build, where you're going to partner, what you're going to buy, what's commodity, what's differentiating, and then kind of align your research, your institution, the skills programs that you have, the research funding and competitions, align all of those behind, if you like, those bets for the technologies that you think are going to be ones that you can be world leading in. But, and this is a big but, then still leave some capacity, going back to the kind of black swan event stuff, for the kind of crazy off-piste unexpected stuff, because you need to have some kind of outlying bets too. But anyway, that's a different kind of thing. But are batteries in that kind of we must be world leading one? I don't know, quite possibly, but the trouble is, with everyone that you put in that group, you're going to knock something else out. What about life sciences? What about omics? What about all the digital technologies? So it's a crowded bag, if you like. I see there's another question.
Thank you.
Here.
Yes, thank you.
There are a couple more questions. I can read them out so that everybody's aware. There's another one from Kostis. He asks, how does the ever-increasing consumption of digital content, such as social media and I guess live streaming, might affect the potential for young people to become real inventors and thinkers?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's difficult for me to answer that question without sounding rather old. I know, as I say, I said a little bit at the start of my talk, where I spent my time, messing around as a child, making things, breaking things, blowing things up and so forth. And I think this is one of these reasons why we need these maker labs. I mean, one of the challenges is that for understandable sort of health and safety reasons, it's quite difficult for young people to get access. And unfortunately, the term maker lab means lots of different things to people, like digital twins. For some people, it means, a room with some sticky back plastic and a 3D printer. When I say maker lab, I mean a lab full of the kind of machines that can hurt you, lathes and CNC machines and welders and things like that. And I think, so these are clearly dangerous, and it's difficult you can't just let people loose. But I think we need to allow people to have a way to gain those kinds of skills. And indeed, I got so frustrated about the fact that I couldn't get access to them for my children that I ended up building a maker lab in the bottom of my garden. And I was lucky enough to have the space to do it, but most people wouldn't. And so this needs to be something that's available for everybody. And so I'm passionate about that. And you're right that there is a lot of competition now from living in digital worlds rather than getting your hands dirty and doing stuff in the physical world. But I think some of that is just because it's hard for young people to have access to those things. They can do a bit of it at school, but it's not the kind of thing that most people can do at home. So I think we need to do that kind of turning up of the dial on the physical. Hope that helps. Shai?
The next two questions are related to each other, from Henry Holmes and David Tansley. So Henry asks, what do you think is government's role in driving these technologies? And do you expect the products that you described to be developed primarily by the private sector? And related to that, David says, what do you think is the role of regulators in fostering and creating the conditions for these innovations? And can they keep protecting their citizens?
Great question. So take them in that order. Typically government waits to intervene until it sees, what it thinks will be market failures. And I think that's a problematic model because, some of the times it is, because what that means is that the things that don't get funded are these kind of enabling pieces of infrastructure that no one business or organization could build for themselves. And you're going to wait forever. You're going to have a true market failure if you don't build them, because no one's going to build them. And I think the role here of government is to build the base layer, the kind of the stuff that is the sovereign capability, the stuff that some of which needs to be properly locked down and secure, for all good reasons, and to create the kind of foundation, if you like, on top of which organizations and businesses can crowd in, and the kind of normal market effects can happen. So, that base layer drives the kind of, if that's the things like the digital commons for connecting smart machines, that's like this kind of pre-competitive Lego that for building smart machines, which arguably you want to kind of open source so that people spend their time on the stuff that adds real value rather than everybody starting from scratch, which is kind of what happens. And so I think it's a layered approach, but that bottom layer around standards and building blocks and shared services and core platforms, that's where we need some vision for and some funding to build this, if you like, on behalf of the country, and then to enable loads of other people to build on top of it. And definitely the main kind of building is going to have to be built, by the private and the public sector. The role of regulators is a really interesting one, and this is something I'm very passionate about. I mean, I think it's crucial that we enable regulators to wear two hats. One is obviously the police person hat that we think of as regulators wearing, but the other is the what does good look like hat, and to be able to spend time looking at what's coming down the line, if you like, and what future technologies are coming and what the implications are for regulation. And indeed, living labs that I talked about are really important here, because they can be a source of data for regulators to allow them to kind of get comfortable with technologies before they kind of hit the open road. But regulators need funding to do this, and the Regulators Pioneer Fund was a great step in this direction, but we need much more. They need much more, otherwise we will stifle innovation. But it's not because I don't believe regulators want to stifle innovation, it's just that they have limited bandwidth for if you like, supporting and looking out at the future innovation and getting ready in time, and doing things like, licensing experiments to allow people to do these kind of innovative experiments, whether it's driving autonomous vehicles or drones or whatever, because we can't just have a free-for-all, clearly, because that, bad things will happen. So I think that is a really important question around regulation. But there's a balancing act, obviously, between regulation and innovation, but it's definitely not the case that, one is the enemy of the other.
So continuing, I think, on a similar thread, Gabe Hughes says, you make a good case for embracing uncertainty and taking risks to innovate. But doesn't this require both UK private and public sector sources of finance to increase their appetite for risks? How do we create a safer environment for innovators and entrepreneurs to take risks and fail fast?
Well, yeah, this has been, I think watch this space and see what comes out in the innovation strategy is what I would suggest. I think it's a really important question. I mean, I spend my time talking to people about, needing to have an appetite for risk and talking about the kind of non-linear nature of innovation and the messiness that I talked about earlier. And it's really hard to get people to understand this, and I think people, are very often very uncomfortable with risk and failure. And I think we have to do it by talking about, case studies, by having exemplars, of successful innovative companies that have had this approach. But this is once again where I think synthetic environments have such an important role to play, because we need people to be able to experiment and model future innovations with less cost and risk. And at the moment, it's the relatively few organizations like the Ocados and the Rolls-Royces and the Arups and a few others who have the kind of skills and capabilities to do this kind of modeling and building digital twins and so forth. But we need to lower the bar to adoption. We need to make this something that is the norm, not the exception. And so that's why part of the vision I talked about is about creating new frameworks for building these kind of environments, but also, you know, templates so that people can kind of adapt them rather than starting from scratch, and can take, if we create this kind of marketplace for synthetic environments and digital twins because of standards and common glue, then people can kind of bolt together things. So for example, if I was wanting to build a simulation for a delivery business, you know, I don't want to start from scratch modeling the road network. I don't want to build, you know, my own weather simulation to be able to take weather into account. I want to be able to import those kind of models and focus on the bit that is really modeling my core part of the business. And that's why I think, you know, this kind of app store, if you like, for models and for AIs and for data and for maps and lots of other digital assets is crucial, because we simply don't have time and resources to constantly, you know, build from the ground up, or rather most people don't. It's expensive, it's difficult, you need very special skills, and it's, you know, we need to make this, you know, in the same way that when I first started writing mobile apps, you know, many years ago, you know, it was pretty challenging and tricky. Now there are all sorts of frameworks to make it really easy for people with, you know, quite an elementary kind of software skills to be able to, you know, construct quite useful, powerful apps themselves or friends or whatever. Well, that's the kind of journey we need to go on with these kind of things, and I think that is going to be really important in order to increase this appetite for risk. Because if you can explore first digitally and see the sense of the possible and understand what impact it might have for your organizational business, then you're going to be able to take it to the board and say, look, you know, here's the kind of worked example. This is why we should do it. Come on, get behind it and fund it.
Paul, you mentioned open source quite a few times already, which I'm very glad on a personal level. So, and the next question, I think, follows in the same thread as you have been that you have been addressing. So David asks, if we are moving from open source to open data to open IPR, would it be that we have open intelligence in the future, or are we some way toward democratization of AI already?
Well, I think the point I was trying to make earlier is I don't think it's all going to be open. You know, I think some of it will be, and that's great, and you know, there will be open sourcing, but I think it's unrealistic to think that, you know, organizations and businesses are just going to open their doors and go, you know what, come on, take what you want. You know, it's all open. Take our data, take our AI models, take our digital twins. It's just not going to happen. Those are and will continue to be incredibly important parts of their competitive advantage. And so, and in some cases, you know, you won't be able to share them with just anybody because of, you know, privacy and ethical concerns and goodness knows what, especially from the public sector. So we're going to have to come up with these better sharing models. I think that's what I was trying to explain. And that's true for all sorts of data assets, AIs, digital twins, maps, you know, smart machine Lego, all sorts of things. So I think if I gave the impression that I thought it was going to be open, I don't think it is. I think the open part will be very interesting, and I think AI for good and technology for good will drive a lot in that area, and I'm very excited about that. But I don't think it's realistic to think that we're just going to, that you know, we're somehow going to move to this kind of open model, so we need to do both is the answer. We need to promote openness where it's applicable and appropriate, but we also need to create these mechanisms for controlled sharing, as I put it, with whom, for what purposes, and potentially at what cost, because, you know, some of these things you're going to have a marketplace for them, a bit like the App Store, you know. Anyway, that's my view on that.
A question from me now, Paul. So I share both your enthusiasm for the opportunities enabled by this merging of the cyber and the physical, but also your concerns, which I think it was part of your discussion as a parent, and the future world that we live to our children. And the one paradox which I've been thinking about for years and years without having a satisfactory solution is the fact that by merging the physical and the digital, we actually make reclaiming materials and recycling, which is an important element of sustainability, much more difficult. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts with regards to addressing that point.
Well, I certainly have been in the past in terms of things I've done. I'm very interested in, obviously things like circular economy and design for maintainability and so forth. And I think once again, I think the idea around greater modularity, particularly when it comes to things like robotics and smart machines, is very important. I mean, do you really want to have one device that is dedicated to cleaning your carpet, one that will mow your lawn, one that will wash your windows, one that will, cook your food, or whatever? I suggest not. I think what we need, a bit like, teaching dogs new tricks, I think through modular robotics and standards, we need to make it easier to create, if you like, platforms, smart machine platforms that can be extended, that can be repaired, that can be reused, that can be taught new tricks, that, when you need it to do something else, it puts down one tool and picks up another, or a bit like a snail climbing out of its shell, the smart bit in the middle climbs out and climbs into a new shell, but it's that smart bit in the middle that probably has, the sensors and the GPUs and the intelligence and the so forth. So I think it's I think modularity and standards are really important there, but I think they can also help in terms of this whole argument around reuse. I suppose I don't really see it as being an issue of combining the software, the digital and the hardware, because in a way the digital is just ephemeral software. The physical is really everything else, from the sensors to the motors to the batteries to the communication systems and so forth. And so I think it's those where we need, once again, more of these standards. At the moment, companies that build those kind of smart machines kind of build them typically themselves from scratch. There isn't the same level of sort of shared frameworks as there is on the software side. So we kind of, that needs to evolve more on the hardware side, so that you can plug and play. When something breaks, you play. More and more of these parts become end user replaceable rather than scrap it or send it off for an expensive repair or whatever. And I think it's almost like it's the way that cars used to be. When I grew up tinkering with cars and taking them apart, you could do it, and if something wasn't quite right, you'd bend the point slightly and then, they'd start working again. Well, forget that now, because it's just, some kind of sealed unit that nobody can replace or tinker with. And I think we've got to kind of, in a way, go back slightly and make sure the hardware we design is more, serviceable and fits within this kind of, there's obviously a whole movement around that kind of, way of thinking at the moment. But there are obviously some very strong forces in the other direction in terms of mass manufacturing and, built-in obsolescence and everything else. So we'll have to see. I'm not super confident, but I do think it's important.
Thank you for that. So at this point, normally, if we didn't have the virus, we would invite you for dinner and to continue the discussion over a drink. But unfortunately, we don't have that this year. So I can only ask colleagues, students, and friends on behalf of the Department of Computer Science and Information Systems and Birkbeck College as a whole, to invite everyone to join me in expressing our thanks to you, Paul, for delivering the 2021 Booth Memorial Lecture and for sharing your vision and your experience and your enthusiasm for the future opportunity presented at the intersection of cyber physical systems. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.